They say when a man's down to his last $17, he'll do things his daddy would have whipped him for. But what happens when pride is all that stands between keeping your land and watching strangers auction it off piece by piece in these uncertain times? When costs keep climbing and honest work seems harder to find. Maybe you understand what it means to count every dollar twice. This here's a story about Jonah McKenna. A decent man who faced that crushing choice back in 1882 when a man's word was his bond and failure meant more than just financial ruin. The coal oil lamp flickered something fierce across those 17 silver dollars scattered on Jonah's kitchen table. All that stood between him and losing everything his daddy had built. His weathered hands shook as he dipped that steel pen in India ink, scratching out words that burned his very soul. Seeking capable woman for timber partnership, room, board, honest work. Outside. February wind rattled through the cabin, chinking like a banshee. The sawmill stood silent as a graveyard, its frozen wheel a monument to better days gone by. Jonah sealed that envelope with trembling fingers, the red wax dripping like blood in the lamplight. Lord willing, someone would answer before Banker Thornley came calling. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. 3 weeks passed before wagon wheels crunched on that frozen gravel outside Jonah's cabin. He'd near forgot about that letter, what with trying to stretch beans and cornmeal through another week. He pushed back from the breakfast table, cold beans still clinging to his spoon like guilt. Through the frost-glazed window, he watched a woman step down from the driver's seat. No escort. No husband trailing behind like you'd expect. She shouldered a canvas tool roll with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Jonah's boots scraped against the pine floor as he opened that door. Cold air slapped his face hard enough to make his eyes water. The woman approached with steady strides, her wool coat practical rather than pretty. Dark hair pinned back severe beneath a woolen hat that had seen better days. "You be Jonah McKenna." Her voice carried the flat vowels of somewhere up North Michigan, maybe Minnesota. "Reckon I am. Ruth Kellerman, from the lumber camps." She shifted that tool roll to her other shoulder like it weighed nothing. "You placed an advertisement seeking help." Heat crawled up Jonah's neck like fire ants. He'd expected someone softer. Maybe. Someone who needed rescuing more than she looked capable of rescuing others. "Coffee's still warm on the stove," he managed. Ruth's boots echoed hollow against his porch boards, each step deliberate as a judge's gavel. Inside, she set that tool roll against the wall with the reverence most folks reserved for family Bibles. The leather showed honest wear oil stains, scuff marks, the kind of patina that comes from constant use by knowing hands. She accepted coffee black as midnight. No sugar. Her hands bore calluses across the palms thick as boot leather, and a thin white scar ran from thumb to wrist, like a badge of honor. "Worked Michigan lumber camps 8 seasons, Ruth said, studying his cabin's interior with the eye of someone pricing timber. "Foreman trusted my grade marks over men with 20 years under their belts." Jonah's coffee cup rattled against the saucer like chattering teeth. "I expected someone helpless." Ruth's eyes found his across that table, sharp as fresh-ground axe blades. "Someone to cook your meals and darn your socks while you pretend to run a lumber operation." The accusation hung between them, thick as wood smoke. "Your letter said, 'capable woman,'" Ruth continued, setting down her cup with authority. Did you mean it? Or were you looking for something prettier and more biddable? Through the window, Jonah could see his sawmill's silent bulk squatting like a reproach against the morning sky. Ruth followed his gaze, then stood without invitation and walked to that window, pressing her work-hardened palm against the cold glass. Water wheels seized solid, she observed with the detachment of a doctor examining a corpse. When do you last cut lumber worth selling? October. Maybe September. Ruth turned from the window, and her expression had changed from wary to calculating, like a woman studying horseflesh at auction. Show me your timber stands. They walked that frozen ground between cabin and mill, breath steaming in the bitter air. Ruth moved like she owned every inch, studying everything with the professional attention of someone who knew quality work from pretense. She stopped at the sawmill entrance, running her fingers along the doorframe where the wood had warped from weather and neglect. Belts are rotted clear through, she said. Matter of fact, as discussing the weather, Jonah wanted to defend his daddy's equipment, but Ruth had already pushed inside that mill like she belonged there. He found her crouched beside the main saw, testing the blade's edge with her thumbnail the way other women might test fabric at the dry goods store. Dull as a butter knife left out in the rain. She looked up at him with those sharp eyes. Just how exactly did you figure to run a lumber operation? But before Jonah could answer, Ruth stood and walked to his log pile, kicking at bark with her boot toe. What she found there made her face go pale as winter morning. Sweet Mary and Joseph, she whispered. You've got beetle kill mixed in with your good timber. The venison stew had gone stone cold, while Ruth sketched on brown wrapping paper spread across Jonah's kitchen table. Her charcoal pencil moved with the confidence of someone who'd drawn mill layouts in lumber camps from here to the Great Lakes. Resaw station here. She tapped the paper with authority. Planer there, if you can manage to find one that ain't been neglected to death. You could triple your board footage with proper arrangement. Jonah leaned closer, catching the scent of machine oil that clung to her clothes like perfume on a fancy lady. The sketch showed his daddy's mill transformed belts repositioned, workflow redesigned. Every inch planned for purpose instead of convenience. This would cost considerable money. Less than you reckon. Ruth set down that pencil with finality. Most of what you need is already here, just arranged by someone who never learned the difference between a sawmill and a kindling pile. She folded that paper with precise creases, like she was handling legal documents. I worked for Hutchinson Lumber 3 seasons up in Saginaw, watched them turn failing operations profitable inside 6 months. By doing what? Exactly, cutting smart instead of cutting fast. Ruth met his eyes across that table, and the kerosene lamp between them cast harsh shadows on her weathered face. No softness there, just calculation hard as January ground. Your hardwood's quality enough. You're just wasting it on dimension lumber when you could be making finish boards that bring real money. Jonah's throat felt dry as August dust. What do you want in return for this assistance? Half the profits after expenses. Ruth's voice held no room for negotiation. Equal partnership in the mill operation. And the other arrangement I mentioned in my advertisement? Ruth's eyebrows lifted like she'd heard something amusing. What other arrangement would that be? Heat climbed Jonah's collar like climbing ivy. I placed that advertisement seeking a wife. Ruth laughed, sharp as breaking kindling. You want someone to warm your bed and birth your babies while you play at running lumber. I thought we might. You thought wrong as rain falling upward. Ruth pushed back from that table, chair legs scraping against rough pine flooring. I need workspace and authority, not husband duties and Sunday prayers. She walked to a single window, staring out at the mill like she was already calculating improvements. I've got near $800 saved from camp wages, enough to buy partnership in a dozen failed operations between here and Michigan. Question is whether yours is worth the trouble of saving. Jonah's mouth had gone dry, as creek bed in drought. What would you need from me? Separate sleeping quarters, full access to equipment and account books, authority to hire workers when we're profitable enough to afford wages. Ruth turned from that window, fixing him with a stare that could nail boards. And no expectations beyond cutting lumber and making money. No expectations of anything else. You heard me clear as church bells. Ruth pulled her coat tighter against the cabin's chill. I'm here to cut timber and earn honest wages, not play house with a man who can't tell seasoned oak from beetle-killed pine. Outside, February wind rattled through the cabin's chinking like skeleton fingers. The cookstove's fire had burned low, casting red shadows across walls that hadn't seen a woman's touch since his mother passed 5 years back. There's a back room behind the kitchen, Jonah said finally. Small, but it's got a window and stays warm from the stove. That'll suit. And you truly believe this mill can pay its debts? Ruth unfolded her sketch again, smoothing the creases with work-hardened palms. With proper management and the Lord's blessing inside 3 months, assuming banker Thornley's willing to wait that long. Thornley wants $600 by April 15th. Then we'd best start cutting lumber come morning. Ruth stood, gathering her things with efficient movements. I assume you can swing an axe without removing important body parts. I've logged before my daddy took to drinking. Good, because we'll need seasoned timber sorted and ready by week's end. Ruth picked up that tool roll, testing its familiar weight. One more thing. McKenna, what's that? I snore something fierce, and I don't cook fancy meals or bake pies for church socials. She moved toward the back room with purpose. Still want a business partner? Jonah watched her disappear through that doorway, her boots striking the floor with authority that claimed space empty too long. He'd expected salvation wrapped in gingham and soft words. Instead, the Almighty had sent him calloused hands and sharp arithmetic. From the back room came sounds of unpacking leather creaking, metal tools settling against wood, the rustle of someone making temporary space permanent through sheer determination. Jonah stoked the cookstove, adding split oak to dying coals. Orange flames licked higher, casting new light through the cabin that felt different somehow, less lonely. But as he prepared for sleep, one question nagged at his mind like a splinter under fingernail. What kind of woman traveled 800 miles alone to save a stranger's failing mill? And why did her tool roll sound like it contained enough equipment to outfit a full logging operation? Dawn came gray and bitter cold, but the scent of coffee and wood smoke already filled the cabin when Jonah stirred from his bedroll, through the thin wall separating his space from the kitchen. He heard Ruth moving with quiet efficiency, the soft scrape of cast iron against the stovetop, the whisper of kindling catching fire, the measured pour of water into the coffee pot. He pulled on his wool pants and stepped into the kitchen to find Ruth fully dressed in her practical blue cotton work dress, dark hair already pinned back severe as a schoolmarm's. She stood at the cook stove, poking split oak into the firebox with movements that spoke of long practice rising before sunrise. Morning, she said without turning around. Coffee's near ready. You're up mighty early. Lumber camps start before first light. Ruth closed the firebox door and adjusted the damper with practiced precision. Daylight's for working, not sleeping. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the liquid black as creek water at midnight. Jonah accepted his cup, wrapping his fingers around the warm metal while steam rose between them like incense. "What's the plan for today?" he asked. "Teaching you to run a lumber operation proper." Ruth walked to the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, breath visible in the cold air. "Starting with sorting your timber pile." They walked across frost-covered ground toward the mill, their boots crunching on ice that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the pale morning light. Ruth moved with purpose, her shorter stride covering ground efficiently while Jonah followed, feeling oddly like a student trailing his teacher. At the timber pile, Ruth began examining logs with the methodical attention of a doctor checking patients. She rolled smaller pieces with her boot, testing for soundness. Larger logs got the tip of her pocket knife driven into the bark to check for rot. "This here's white oak," she said, tapping a thick log with her knuckles. The sound came back solid, resonant. "Hear that tone? That's good heartwood. Seasoned proper." Jonah listened to the sound, trying to understand what Ruth heard that he'd missed for years. "This pine's got resin pockets." Ruth pointed to dark streaks in the bark. "Still usable, but you gotta cut around the defects or the boards will weep sap forever." She continued down the line, sorting timber into piles that made sense to her but looked random to Jonah. Her movements were efficient, certain, the work of someone who'd graded thousands of logs in Michigan lumber camps. "Your daddy had good instincts for quality timber," Ruth observed, rolling a maple log to examine its full length. "But he mixed prime logs with second-grade wood." Ruth straightened, brushing bark chips from her hands. "This maple could bring 40 cents a board foot as quarter-sawn lumber. Bet your daddy sold it for 15 cents as rough planking." The accusation stung because it held truth Jonah couldn't deny. His father had always seemed grateful for any sale, never questioning if he was getting fair value for quality timber. "Come on," Ruth said, heading toward the mill building. "Let's see if we can make that sawmill actually cut lumber." Inside the mill, Ruth examined every piece of equipment with the thoroughness of a general inspecting troops. She tested belt tension, checked blade alignment, and ran her thumb along the saw's edge. "Dull as a church social," she pronounced. "When'd this blade last see a file? My father handled the maintenance." Ruth walked to the grinding wheel and began pumping the foot treadle. The stone spun up with a whisper that grew to a steady hum. "Hold the blade steady while I sharpen it." Jonah positioned his hands where Ruth indicated, feeling the saw blade's weight and the slight vibration as the grinding wheel touched steel. Sparks flew in orange streams, and the sharp scent of hot metal filled the air. "Feel that?" Ruth asked as she worked the blade across the stone. "Blade's taking a proper edge now." When she finished, the saw teeth gleamed like rows of silver needles. Ruth tested the edge with her thumbnail, nodding satisfaction at the result. "Now we can cut lumber instead of just making noise." Ruth selected a medium oak log and positioned it on the saw carriage with movements that showed familiarity with the equipment. She adjusted the log's position twice, checking alignment before engaging the feed mechanism. "Watch the grain," she instructed. "See how it runs. We cut with the grain, not against it." She started the water wheel, and the mill came alive with mechanical song belts turning, gears meshing, the saw blade spinning up to cutting speed. The sound was different from when his father ran the mill, smoother and more purposeful. Ruth engaged the saw, and the blade bit into oak with a clean, singing note. Golden sawdust flew in streams that caught the morning light streaming through the mill's open doors. The first board fell free, its surface smooth as silk. Jonah picked up the board, running his fingers along its length. No tear out, no saw marks, No rough spots that would require sanding. Just clean. Straight lumber that would command premium prices. "When's the last time your mill cut anything that clean?" Ruth asked over the engine noise. Jonah couldn't remember. Maybe never. They cut boards until midday, Ruth demonstrating techniques his father had never learned or had forgotten through years of drinking away his skills. She showed Jonah how to read grain patterns, how to position logs for maximum yield, how to adjust feed speed for different wood types. "Quarter sawn oak like this," Ruth said, positioning another log. "You cut it perpendicular to the growth rings. Makes boards that won't warp or cup, even in summer heat." Each cut revealed the distinctive ray fleck pattern that buyers paid extra for. Ruth worked with mechanical precision, positioning logs and adjusting the saw with minimal wasted motion. By afternoon, they'd created a neat stack of quality lumber, 23 boards of various sizes, all cut clean and true, more productive work than the mill had seen in months. Ruth shut down the engine and began cleaning the saw blade with a rag soaked in linseed oil. "Not bad for a first day," she said, examining their pile of finished lumber. "You make it look easy." "Easy comes from doing something 1,000 times wrong before you learn to do it right." Ruth hung the oil-soaked rag on a nail near the workbench. "I ate plenty of cold beans while I figured out the difference between cutting lumber and just cutting wood." They walked back to the cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened across the mill yard. Ruth moved with the satisfied tiredness of someone who'd accomplished meaningful work. "Supper?" Jonah asked as they reached the cabin porch. "Just coffee for now." Ruth settled into one of the rough wooden chairs he'd built years ago. "Too tired to be properly hungry?" She pulled a small leather notebook from her vest pocket and began writing with a pencil stub worn smooth from use. "What's that?" Jonah asked. "Production record." Ruth didn't look up from her careful script. 23 boards today, 47 board feet of oak. Current market price is 18 cents per foot." Jonah watched her calculate, multiplying figures in her head faster than he could follow. "That's $8.46 worth of lumber." Ruth closed the notebook with a snap. "Not counting labor costs or overhead expenses. In one day, half a day." "Really?" Ruth met his eyes across the small space between their chairs. "We started late, because you didn't know how to sort timber or sharpen blades." The criticism was delivered without malice, just professional assessment of wasted time and efficiency. "Tomorrow we start earlier," Ruth continued. "Sunrise to sunset. We should cut 60 board feet easy. Maybe 80, if that water wheel keeps running smooth." She stood and stretched her back, working out the kinks from bending over machinery all day. "I'm turning in. We rise before dawn from now on." Ruth disappeared into the back room, leaving Jonah alone with the dying fire and the scent of sawdust that clung to his clothes like a promise. He sat in the gathering darkness, listening to Ruth moving around her small space, preparing for sleep with the quiet efficiency that marked everything she did. $8 in half a day's work. More money than he'd seen in weeks of struggle and worry. But as he banked the fire and prepared for his own rest, one thought nagged at him like a splinter under skin. How had Ruth known exactly what his mill needed before she'd ever seen the equipment run? And why did her leather notebook look like it contained far more than just today's production figures? 2 weeks fell into a pattern that surprised Jonah with how natural it felt, like slipping on well-broken boots. Ruth rose before first light, built up the cook stove fire, and had coffee brewing strong enough to wake the dead when he stumbled from his bedroll. He tended the horses while she organized timber selection for the day's work. No words wasted on morning pleasantries, just the comfortable silence of folks who understood their purpose. The sawmill ran 6 days a week now. Ruth had replaced the worst belts with leather strips she'd brought from Michigan lumber camps, stitched and riveted with the precision of a clockmaker. That main saw blade stayed sharp under her care, honed each evening with a whetstone she kept oiled in a wooden box like some folks kept jewelry. "Quarter-sawn oak brings premium money," Ruth explained, positioning a hefty log on the carriage with the ease of someone who'd done this work since she could barely reach the controls. "Cut it proper. You get straight grain and stable lumber that won't warp come summer heat." Jonah watched her hands guide that log through multiple cuts, each board revealing the distinctive ray fleck pattern that buyers paid extra for. Her movements were economical, practiced. No motion wasted on show or uncertainty. "How'd you learn about grain patterns and such? Mistakes, mostly." Ruth brushed golden sawdust from her wool skirt with calloused palms. "Cut enough lumber wrong. Watching good timber turn to scrap pile. You figure out the right way pretty quick." Their first real customer appeared on a Thursday morning, when the frost still sparkled on the mill roof like scattered diamonds. Samuel Gentry from the general store, needing shelving boards for his expansion, arrived in a wagon that creaked under the weight of his considerable bulk. "Heard tell you're running this mill again," Gentry said, examining their stacked lumber with the eye of a man who knew quality work from pretense. "This here oak, quarter-sawn white oak," Ruth replied, wiping her hands on a rag that smelled of linseed oil and honest sweat. 15 cents a board foot, and worth every penny. Gentry ran his thumb along a board's surface, testing for smoothness. The wood showed no tear-out, no saw marks clean. Straight lumber that would serve a man well. "Mighty fine work. No complaints here?" He selected 10 boards from their best stack. "I'll take these." Ruth calculated quickly in her small leather notebook, pencil stub moving across ruled lines. 63 board feet, $9.45 total. "Fair price for such fine workmanship." Gentry counted out silver coins that clinked together like music. "I'll need more come next month for the store's back room." "We'll have it ready, Lord willing," Ruth assured him. After Gentry's wagon disappeared down the valley road, dust settling behind like a blessing. Jonah stared at those silver coins warming his palm, real payment for actual lumber, not credit or promises, but money that would buy beans and bacon and maybe even tobacco for his pipe. "When's the last time you sold lumber for hard cash?" Ruth asked. Watching his face with those sharp eyes of hers, "Can't rightly recall." "Then we're making progress. Sure enough." Evening brought its own comfortable routine. Ruth cooked simple fare beans with salt pork, cornbread that rose proper, occasionally venison when Jonah's hunting proved successful. She ate with the same efficiency she brought to lumber work. No conversation until business matters needed discussing. But the silence felt companionable, rather than empty. "Gentry's order got us noticed," Ruth said over supper, spooning beans onto tin plates that reflected lamplight like mirrors. "Miller from Cedar Valley stopped by today while you were checking the timber stands. Wants 200 board feet of pine flooring. We've got good pine logs, seasoned proper." "Right, good pine logs," Ruth corrected, pulling out her notebook with the reverence other women reserved for prayer books. "Pine flooring brings 12 cents a foot if we cut it true. That's $24 if we don't waste wood on poor planning." Jonah watched her calculate lumber yields and profit margins, pencil moving across those pages with certainty born of experience. Her figures were neat, orderly. The work of someone accustomed to keeping accounts that mattered. "You keep mighty detailed records," he observed. "Habit from the camps." Ruth closed that notebook with a snap. Foreman who couldn't track lumber costs and daily production didn't keep his position long, and camp workers went hungry when operations failed. How long did you work those camps? 8 seasons. Started right after Thomas passed on to his reward. Thomas? Ruth's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Beans balanced like judgment. My husband. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy as incense at Sunday service. Ruth resumed eating without elaboration, but something in her posture had changed. Shoulders drawn tight as bowstrings. He was a logger, Jonah asked, gentle as he could manage. Timber cruiser? Evaluated stands for cutting, marked trees for harvest. Ruth's voice stayed level as creek water, but her knuckles showed white where she gripped that spoon. Good at his work. Careful with safety rules. What happened to him? Widowmaker. Ruth set down her spoon with deliberate control. Pine tree, near 100 feet tall, got hung up in another tree's branches after a storm. Thomas was marking timber beneath it when the wind shifted wrong. She stood and began clearing dishes, her back straight and rigid as fence posts. Took 3 strong men to dig him out from under that tree. By then, Ruth carried those dishes to the wash basin, pumping water with sharp, efficient strokes that spoke of long practice, keeping grief at bay through honest work. I'm sorry for your loss, Jonah said. Long time past now. Ruth's hands stilled on the dishes, and for a moment her voice carried weight of years. Point being, logging's dangerous work. Marriage to loggers even more so. Is that why you don't want... I don't want complications. Ruth's hands resumed their washing, soap suds gleaming white in the lamplight. This here's business, lumber and profit and honest wages. Nothing else needs saying. Of course. But as Ruth washed those dishes in the lamplight, Jonah caught himself watching the way her hair escaped its pins to curl against her neck, darkened with steam from the hot water, the efficient movements of her work-hardened hands, the straight line of her shoulders beneath that practical cotton blouse that had seen better days, but was clean and mended with careful stitches. Business, he reminded himself. Nothing more than business. The next morning brought their largest order yet. William Thornley's eldest son needed lumber for a new barn, $60 worth of dimensional pine and oak framing, enough to keep the mill running for weeks. Thornley's boy, Ruth asked, looking up from her morning coffee with sudden attention. As in Banker Thornley, who holds your note, same family, sure enough. Ruth's expression sharpened like a blade taking an edge. Mighty interesting timing, wouldn't you say? Meaning what? Exactly. Meaning bankers' sons don't usually buy lumber from mills they're fixing to foreclose on. Ruth selected a pine log for the carriage, testing its weight with practiced hands. Unless something's changed in their calculations, young Thornley arrived that afternoon to inspect the lumber order, dressed in city clothes that had never seen honest work. He walked through their stacks with careful attention, testing boards for straightness and examining each piece for defects like a man who knew quality when he saw it. Fine workmanship, he admitted, running his palm along a smooth pine plank. Father said this mill was finished, but this work proves otherwise. What else did your daddy say? Ruth asked. Direct as a nail to wood. That failed mills stay failed, and McKenna would be lucky to get 50 cents on the dollar when the bank takes over. Young Thornley counted out payment from a leather pouch, silver coins ringing against each other. Reckon he was wrong about that. After his wagon disappeared down the valley road, Ruth stood in the mill doorway watching dust settle, her expression thoughtful as a preacher considering Sunday's sermon. $60, she said finally, plus Gentry's order and that pine flooring agreement. We're showing real profit now. Jonah felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope. Maybe, or relief that had been stranger to him than city ways. Enough to pay Thornley come April. Getting mighty close. Ruth pulled her notebook from her vest, flipping through pages of neat figures. $200 more by month's end. We'll clear that debt with money left over for equipment improvements. And if we fall short, Ruth's pencil tapped against the notebook cover like a woodpecker working dead bark. Then we lose everything. Mill, timber stands. This land your daddy cleared with his own hands. She looked at him directly, those sharp eyes holding his. But we're not fixing to let that happen. The certainty in her voice made Jonah believe her words like gospel truth. This woman who'd appeared from nowhere with calloused hands and sharp arithmetic, transforming his failing mill into profitable enterprise through skill and determination he'd never possessed. But that night, as he listened to Ruth moving around in the back room, preparing for sleep with the efficient sounds of someone accustomed to temporary quarters, one question nagged at him like splinter under skin. What would happen to their partnership once that mill was saved and debts were cleared? And why did the answer suddenly matter more than the money itself? The sound of expensive wagon wheels on gravel came at the worst possible time, right when Jonah was elbow-deep in sawdust, feeding oak planks through the resaw like his daddy should have taught him years back. Ruth's voice cut sharp through the mill's mechanical song. "Shut her down! What's that? Kill that engine, right now!" Jonah pulled the brake lever, and sudden silence fell over the mill like a funeral shroud. In that quiet, he heard what Ruth's sharp ears had caught first, the deliberate crunch of quality wagon wheels, the musical jingle of harness hardware that cost more than most men earned in a season. Through the mill's open doors, Jonah watched a black buggy approach with all the ceremony of a hearse. Gold paint gleamed on the wheel, spokes like fool's promises. The driver wore a wool coat that probably cost more than Jonah's best horse, and he climbed down with the careful movements of a man protecting his considerable dignity. "Thornley," Ruth said, flat as hammered iron. The banker surveyed their lumber operation with pale, calculating eyes that missed nothing worth cataloging. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore the expression of a man who'd come to collect what was rightfully his. "McKenna!" Thornley's voice carried the authority of money and position. "Didn't expect to find you still operating this enterprise." "Mr. Thornley." Jonah wiped sawdust from his hands on pants that showed honest wear. "What brings you all the way out here? Business, naturally?" Thornley's gaze shifted to Ruth like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "And who might this be?" Ruth stepped forward, chin raised with the dignity of someone who'd earned respect through skill rather than inheritance. "Ruth Kellerman, Mr. McKenna's working partner." "Working partner." Thornley's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline like surprised caterpillars. "In what capacity? Might I ask, mill operations?" Ruth's voice stayed level as a carpenter's square. "Production management, accounts keeping, customer dealings." Thornley opened his portfolio with the flourish of a preacher revealing scripture, withdrawing papers that bore the territorial seal in red wax. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. McKenna, anything you've got to say can be said in front of Miss Kellerman," Jonah replied, surprised by the steel in his own voice. "Very well." Thornley unfolded the top document with ceremony. "Your note comes due April 15th. $600 principal, plus accumulated interest at 8% per annum. Total amount owed stands at $647. Ruth pulled her small leather notebook from her vest pocket. opening it with the reverence other women reserved for family Bibles. "We're well aware of the debt structure. Mr. Thornley." "Are you indeed?" Thornley's tone turned condescending as a schoolmaster addressing slow children. "And do you possess $647 in ready cash?" "We'll have it by April 15th, Lord willing." Ruth opened her notebook, revealing columns of figures written in script, neat as copybook examples. "Current production yields 400 board feet weekly at an average price of 14 cents per foot. Minus operating costs and material expenses, we net $38 weekly." Thornley glanced at the notebook with the dismissive air of a man who'd never trusted women's arithmetic. "Female calculations rarely account for reality. Miss Kellerman." Ruth's jaw tightened so slightly that only someone watching close would notice. "Would you care to examine our customer agreements?" "Agreements." Thornley laughed, sharp as breaking glass. "From whom gentry?" "My own son hardly guaranteed income streams." Ruth pulled folded papers from her notebook with the deliberation of someone producing evidence in court. "Pine flooring agreement with Miller from Cedar Valley. Dimensional lumber contract with the new Methodist church construction. Cabinet wood order from Henderson's Furniture Works in Carson Valley." She spread the contracts on the mill's work table like a card sharp, revealing a winning hand. "Total contracted value, $412. Delivery dates scheduled through April 10th. Thornley examined the documents, his expression shifting from amusement through concern to something approaching respect. "These appear legitimate." "They are legitimate as Sunday service." Ruth's voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut kindling. "As is our production capability to fulfill every contract on schedule." "Even so." Thornley refolded the documents with careful precision. "Contracts don't guarantee payment. Customers default on obligations. Equipment fails at critical moments. Weather delays production schedules." "Equipment's running fine as frog's hair." Jonah gestured at the mill that hummed with well-oiled efficiency. "Production's ahead of every schedule we've set." "For now, perhaps." Thornley returned the contracts to Ruth with patronizing ceremony. "But what happens when your working partner decides to seek more suitable employment?" "Women rarely maintain commitment to such demanding enterprises." Ruth's knuckles whitened as she gripped that notebook like a lifeline. "My commitment extends until every debt is satisfied, and this operation shows steady profit." "And then what, Miss Kellerman?" "Then we'll discuss future arrangements as circumstances warrant." Ruth's voice stayed steady, but Jonah caught the slight tremor in her hands as she closed the notebook. Thornley smiled with the satisfaction of a cat cornering mice. "You see, McKenna temporary assistance at best. Once she's earned her wages, she'll be gone to seek security elsewhere. Probably has family waiting somewhere back east." "I'm widowed, Mr. Thornley." Ruth's words fell flat and final as hammer blows. "And my wages depend entirely on this mill's continued success." "Widowed?" Thornley's tone softened with false sympathy thick as molasses. "All the more reason to seek stability elsewhere. My dear, lumber mills are risky enterprises for a woman alone in the world." Ruth stepped closer to Thornley, close enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes. "This woman alone has increased production 300% in 4 weeks' time, cut waste by 60% through proper planning, secured more contracts than this mill saw in the previous year combined." "Impressive claims, certainly." "Documented facts?" Ruth tapped her notebook with authority. "Which I'll be pleased to review with any auditor you care to send." Thornley's pale eyes flicked between Ruth and Jonah like a man calculating odds at poker. Very well. You have until April 15th, $647, complete payment, no extensions, no partial settlements. He climbed back into his buggy, settling his bulk onto leather seat cushions that probably cost more than most families earned in months. And McKenna, when this arrangement fails, and mark my words, it will fail, remember that I warned you about trusting women with men's work. The buggy rolled away, wheels crunching on gravel until the sound faded into forest silence, broken only by wind through pine branches and the distant call of ravens. Ruth stood motionless as carved stone, watching dust settle on the road like flour through a sieve. Her breathing came quick and shallow, each breath visible in the cold air. Condescending son of a... Ruth caught herself, jaw clamping shut on words that would have blistered paint. Ruth, did you hear him? Female calculations, temporary assistance. Women with men's work. Ruth's voice rose like steam pressure building in a boiler. I've run lumber operations that generated more profit in a season than his precious bank sees in a year. I've calculated board footage for mills from Michigan to Minnesota, but because I wear skirts instead of breeches, my numbers don't signify. Your numbers saved this mill from foreclosure. Tell that to Banker Thornley. Ruth opened her notebook again, flipping through pages of calculations with hands that shook slightly. 43 days until that note comes due. We need $203 more to clear the debt completely. Can we manage it? Ruth studied her figures like a general examining battlefield maps. If nothing goes wrong, if equipment doesn't break down, if customers pay their obligations on time, if weather cooperates with our production schedule, and if something does go sideways... Ruth closed the notebook with a sharp snap that echoed through the mill like a gunshot. Then we lose everything your daddy built with his own hands. She walked to the mill doors, staring out at timber stands that represented their only hope of salvation. Her shoulders held rigid as fence posts, but Jonah caught the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke again. There's something else. McKenna, something Banker Thornley doesn't know about. What's that? Ruth turned from the doorway, and in the afternoon light her face looked drawn, older than her years. Lines of worry creased around her eyes like tributaries feeding a troubled stream. Those contracts I showed him, they're real as sunrise, but they all depend on one thing holding together, which is the main drive belt. It's been patched twice already with leather strips and prayer, the original materials wearing thin as hope. Ruth's fingers worried the edge of her notebook like worry beads. If that belt fails during peak production, we lose every contract, every dollar, everything. Jonah felt his stomach drop like a stone down a well shaft. How long will it hold? Ruth's eyes met his across the mill floor, and in them he saw knowledge that chilled him more than February wind. I honestly don't know. The belt snapped at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, just as Jonah was feeding their finest oak log through the saw $60 worth of prime lumber that would have paid for winter supplies and then some. The crack echoed through the mill like a rifle shot, followed by the grinding shriek of machinery seizing up like a dying animal. Sawdust hung in the air, thick as fog, golden motes dancing in shafts of sunlight that now seemed to mock their efforts. The oak log sat half-cut on the carriage, ruined beyond salvage, too short for planking, too damaged for dimensional lumber, fit for nothing but kindling. Ruth stood frozen beside the dead engine, staring at the torn leather belt that dangled like a broken snake from the drive wheels. Her face had gone white as fresh flour. $60 worth of oak, she whispered, voice hollow as an empty church. Ruined. Jonah pulled the useless log from the carriage, his hands coming away sticky with pine pitch and his own sweat that had turned cold as creek water. "How bad is it?" Ruth examined the belt's torn ends with the careful attention of a doctor examining mortal wounds. The leather had split clean along a seam that had been patched twice before with strips and prayer. "Bad as it gets. This was our last decent belt." "Can we patch it again?" "With what?" Ruth's voice carried the flat tone of complete defeat. "Nearest suppliers in Carson City, 2 days hard riding, assuming they've got replacement belts in stock, which they probably don't." Jonah calculated time in his head, like counting coins he didn't have. The Methodist Church lumber order was due Friday. Henderson's furniture maker expected his cabinet wood next Monday. Every day of delay meant canceled contracts and unpaid bills that would pile up like winter snow. "What about splicing in new leather?" Ruth held up the torn belt, studying it like a death warrant. "With leather this thin, look at these edges worn down to nothing. First real load would snap it again, probably take the whole drive system with it." She walked to the tool bench and pulled out a coil of rawhide cord with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "There might be one way. Splice new leather strips into the break. Reinforce with metal brackets and plenty of prayer." "Will it hold together?" "Maybe." Ruth's hands trembled as she measured the damaged belt against fresh leather strips. "Or maybe it fails after an hour and we lose everything anyway." They worked through the afternoon, cutting leather strips from every scrap they could find in the mill and cabin. Ruth's saddlebags yielded a spare bridle that she sacrificed with the resignation of someone giving up treasured belongings. Jonah contributed his winter boots, slicing the tops into usable strips with his sharpest knife. The repair work demanded precision that their trembling hands couldn't provide. Ruth cursed under her breath words she'd learned in lumber camps as her knife slipped, cutting a leather strip too narrow to be useful. Jonah fumbled with metal brackets, dropping rivets that rolled across the mill floor like scattered hopes. By evening, their hands were bloody from handling sharp tools and rough leather. Ruth's knuckles bore deep cuts from the leather knife that had turned slippery with her own blood. Jonah's palms were raw from gripping metal brackets, blisters forming and breaking and forming again. "It's not going to work," Ruth said, examining their crude repair by lamplight. "Look at this splice joint. It's crooked, uneven, held together with hope and desperation. First real load will tear it apart like wet paper." "It has to work. We've got no choice." "Has to doesn't mean will." Ruth threw down her knife, and it clattered against the stone mill floor like falling coins. "I should have replaced this belt weeks ago. Should have ordered spare parts from Michigan before we started pushing production." She leaned against the workbench, her shoulders sagging under weight that went beyond physical exhaustion. In the lamplight, her face looked gray as ashes, aged by failure and self-recrimination. "This is my fault," she continued, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I knew that belt was marginal. Kept pushing production anyway, chasing contracts like a fool, chasing fool's gold. We both pushed production to meet those orders. You trusted my judgment." Ruth's voice broke slightly, like ice cracking under spring thaw. "And my judgment was wrong as sin." They ate cold beans for supper, neither having energy to build up the cooking fire that had gone cold hours ago. Ruth picked at her food like a bird, occasionally glancing toward the mill where their pathetic repair job waited like a death sentence. "Tell me about Thomas," Jonah said finally, needing to break the silence that was crushing them both. Ruth's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, beans balanced like accusations. "Why? Because you've never talked about him proper, and tonight you look like someone carrying ghosts that won't rest." Ruth set down her spoon with deliberate care. Thomas was careful, methodical as a clockmaker, never took unnecessary risks or made hasty decisions. Sounds like a good husband to have. He was the best kind of husband. Ruth's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, like reading Braille. Thomas planned everything twice, executed once, used to say hasty decisions killed more loggers than falling trees or equipment failures. What would he think of our situation here? Ruth was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee like it held answers to prayers she'd stopped praying. He'd say I was being reckless, gambling everything we'd built on equipment I knew was failing. And what would you tell him? That he'd be right as rain. Ruth's voice cracked like dry kindling. Thomas died because someone else made a hasty decision, left a widowmaker hanging in the canopy instead of cutting it down proper when they had the chance. She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mill's dark bulk that squatted like a reproach against the star-filled sky. I swore on his grave I'd never make that kind of mistake, never let carelessness or impatience kill something important. Ruth, and here I am, risking your mill, your daddy's land, your future on a belt held together with boot leather and desperate hope. Her reflection in the window glass showed tears she wouldn't let fall. Thomas used to say that failure was just another word for poor planning and hasty execution. Maybe Thomas never faced bankruptcy with bill collectors at the door. No. Ruth's voice came thick with unshed tears. He never had to watch everything he'd worked for fall apart in his hands because of his own poor choices. They returned to the mill at midnight, working by the light of 3 coal oil lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the walls like demons mocking their efforts. The repair required threading leather strips through metal brackets, then riveting everything together with hand-forged pins that had to be set perfect, or the whole assembly would fail. Ruth's fingers, slick with machine oil and blood from her cut knuckles, fumbled with the tiny rivets like trying to thread needles in a windstorm. I can't get them to seat proper. My hands won't stop shaking. Let me try. Jonah's hands were steadier, but the work demanded precision his calloused fingers couldn't provide. The rivets kept slipping, falling to the floor with metallic pings that sounded like coins dropping into a collection plate. This is hopeless as trying to nail jelly to a tree, Ruth said, holding up her palms to show deep cuts from the leather knife and grease stains that had worked into every crease and callus. Blood from her knuckles had mixed with machine oil to create dark smears across her fingers like war paint. I used to be good with my hands, she continued, voice thick with self-disgust. Could thread a needle by lamplight, splice rope in a storm, repair harness that other folks would throw away. Ruth's voice turned harsh as sandpaper. Look at them trembling like aspen leaves. I'm no better than a drunkard trying to pour whiskey. She was right. Her fingers trembled with exhaustion and strain, making the delicate repair work nearly impossible. Every time she tried to position a rivet, her hands betrayed her with tremors that spoke of complete nervous collapse. We both need rest, Jonah said, though dawn was still hours away. We don't have time for rest. Church orders due Friday morning. If we don't start cutting lumber tomorrow, if we don't rest, we'll botch this repair completely and lose everything anyway. Ruth stared at the partially mended belt, their patchwork creation that looked pathetic in the lamplight, mismatched leather strips held together with crude metal brackets and desperation. It's not going to work, she said, voice flat as hammered metal. It might hold long enough. And if it doesn't, what then? Ruth's voice rose like steam pressure building toward explosion. We lose the mill, the land, everything your daddy built with his own sweat and blood. Thornley forecloses, and I'm left with nothing but bloody hands and broken promises. Ruth, I failed Thomas by not being there when that tree fell. Failed myself by thinking I could run away from grief and make it disappear. And now I'm failing you just like I fail everything I touch. She sank onto a wooden crate, head in her oil-stained hands that shook like she had fever chills. Maybe Banker Thornley was right. Maybe women don't belong in lumber mills, trying to do men's work with tools too heavy for their hands. Jonah knelt beside her, close enough to smell machine oil in her hair, and the exhaustion that clung to her skin like smoke. Thomas died in a logging accident. How exactly could you have prevented that? I could have been there. Ruth's shoulders shook, but no tears came. She'd used them all up years ago. At least then I wouldn't have to keep failing people who trusted me. You haven't failed me. Look around. Ruth gestured at their crude repair work, the scattered tools, the mill that sat silent as a tomb. This is what failure looks like. This is what happens when someone with more pride than sense tries to save something she doesn't understand. Jonah touched her shoulder, feeling the rigid tension there like coiled wire. This is what happens when someone cares enough to try. Ruth looked up, her eyes red with exhaustion and something deeper than physical tiredness. And if our belt breaks tomorrow, if we lose everything we've worked for, then we lose it together. Ruth studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something she couldn't name. Why does that matter to you? Because, Jonah stopped, realizing he didn't have an answer that made sense even to himself. Because it does. Ruth returned to the belt repair, her hands steadier now despite everything. Hand me that rivet. They worked until dawn crept through the mill windows like hope returning after the darkest night. The repaired belt looked fragile as a spider's web, held together with determination and improvised hardware that had no business working. Will it hold? Jonah asked, afraid to hope. Ruth examined their work with professional attention that masked her fears. Maybe, for a spell. She walked to the engine controls, her hand hovering over the start lever like someone preparing to pull a trigger. Once we engage this belt, there's no going back. If it fails under load, we're finished as surely as if lightning struck the mill. And if we don't try, we're finished anyway. Ruth's jaw set with determination born of having nothing left to lose. Stand clear! She pulled the lever. The engine coughed to life like a resurrection. Belts began to turn, and the saw blade spun up to cutting speed with the sweet song of machinery running true. The repaired section passed over the drive wheel once, twice, 3 times. No sign of failure yet. But Ruth's face remained tense as watch springs. But as Ruth selected the first oak log for cutting, Jonah noticed something that made his blood freeze colder than January creek water. A thin crack was already forming in the leather, right at the main splice joint where their desperate repair met original material. How long before that hairline crack spread and tore their hope apart like wet paper? The belt held for 3 days that felt like 3 years. 3 days of careful, measured cuts with Ruth monitoring every revolution of the drive wheel like a doctor watching a patient's heartbeat. That hairline crack at the splice joint grew longer each hour, a dark line that promised complete failure at the worst possible moment. On Thursday morning, Samuel Gentry arrived with news that changed everything. His wagon clattered into the mill yard with unusual urgency, and he climbed down wearing clothes that still smelled of smoke and ash. School burned down last night, he announced without preamble, soot streaking his face like war paint. Lightning strike during that storm. Nothing left but foundation stones and memories. Jonah set down his coffee cup with hands that had suddenly gone unsteady. Anyone hurt? No injuries? Praise the Almighty. But the whole community's meeting this afternoon to plan rebuilding. Gentry's eyes moved between Jonah and Ruth, with the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. We need lumber. More lumber than this valley's ever seen cut at one time. Ruth emerged from the mill, wiping her hands on a rag that smelled of linseed oil and honest sweat. How much lumber are we talking about? Everything you can cut in 2 weeks' time: framing timber, siding boards, flooring planks, window casings. The whole community's pooling money for materials because those children need their school back before winter sets in hard. What's the price? Ruth asked. Direct as always. 18 cents a board foot for everything. Premium rate because we need it fast. And quality work commands quality wages. Ruth pulled out her notebook, calculating rapidly with pencil stub that had seen better days. How many board feet total? 4,000, maybe 5,000. Gentry shifted his weight nervously, hat in hand like a man asking favors he wasn't sure he deserved. I know it's a mighty big order, but those children are our future. Ruth's pencil froze on the paper like ice forming on still water. 5,000 board feet at 18 cents each meant $900. More than enough to pay Thornley, buy new equipment, and set them up for years of prosperity. But 5,000 board feet meant running the mill at absolute maximum capacity for 2 straight weeks. That patched belt would never survive such strain. It was already failing under normal loads. We'll take the contract, Ruth said without hesitation. Jonah stared at her like she'd announced plans to fly to the moon. Ruth. We'll have your lumber ready in 10 days, Lord willing, Ruth continued, ignoring Jonah's look of alarm that could have stopped a charging bull. After Gentry's wagon disappeared down the valley road, trailing dust and desperate hope, Jonah cornered Ruth in the mill where she was already selecting logs for the massive order. That belt won't last 10 days of heavy production. It's already showing cracks that grow longer every hour. I know that as well as you do. Ruth examined the growing fracture in the leather with the calm of someone who'd accepted fate. But if we don't take this contract, Miller's operation will still be broke come April. If the belt fails halfway through production, we'll have wasted lumber and labor on an order we can't complete. The community will be left with no school and no money. Then we make sure it doesn't fail. Ruth walked to her tool chest and pulled out a coil of steel wire like she was drawing sword from scabbard. We reinforce every weak spot, baby that machinery like it was made of spun glass, and pray harder than we've ever prayed in our lives. The first day of intensive production revealed the full scope of their challenge and their desperation. The mill had to run from first light until full darkness, processing logs at twice their normal rate. Every revolution of the drive wheel stressed that patched belt beyond any reasonable expectation of survival. Ruth positioned herself where she could watch both the saw operation and the belt splice simultaneously. Her eyes never left that growing crack, tracking its progress like a general watching enemy troops advance across a battlefield. Stop, she called out during the afternoon shift, voice sharp as breaking glass. Belts slipping. They shut down the mill and crowded around the drive wheel like mourners at a funeral. The leather splice had stretched under constant stress, creating slack that caused the belt to jump on the pulleys with each revolution. Can we tighten it? Jonah asked, though he already knew the answer from Ruth's expression. Already at maximum tension. Ruth examined the belt's mounting hardware with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion. We add any more pressure. The leather will tear completely and take the whole system with it. She pulled wire from her tool chest and began wrapping it around the splice joint. Binding the cracked leather together with steel reinforcement that looked like surgical stitches on a wound too deep to heal properly. "This might give us another day," she said, twisting the wire tight with pliers until her knuckles went white from strain. "Maybe two if we're careful and the good Lord's watching over us." They restarted the mill and continued cutting. But now Ruth checked the belt every hour like a mother checking a sick child's fever. She added more wire reinforcement as new cracks appeared, creating a patchwork of metal and leather that belonged in a museum of desperate measures. By Friday evening, they'd processed half the school order. The belt looked like a battlefield casualty wrapped in wire, patched with metal brackets, held together by desperation and mechanical ingenuity that had no business working. "How's it holding?" Jonah asked during their evening inspection, dreading the answer. Ruth ran her fingers along the wire wrapping like reading scripture in Braille. "Like something that should have been replaced 6 months ago." "Will it last another week?" "I don't know." Ruth's voice carried exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness, down into her very bones. Every revolution could be the last. Every cut could be the one that finishes us. Saturday brought their worst crisis yet. The main crack finally reached the belt's edge, creating a flap of loose leather that caught on the drive wheel housing with each revolution, making sounds like a dying animal. "That's it," Ruth said, watching the loose flap snap against the pulley with mechanical regularity. "We're done. Finished." But instead of shutting down like any sensible person would have done, she grabbed her sharpest leather knife and carefully trimmed away the loose flap, creating a clean edge that barely cleared the housing. "Ruth, that's not safe. Nothing about this whole operation is safe." Ruth stepped back from the machinery, knife still gripped in her fist. "But those children need their school, and we need that money more than we need to play it safe." She restarted the mill, and somehow that belt continued to turn. The trimmed edge created vibration that ran through the entire building, but the leather held together through sheer determination and whatever grace God grants to fools and desperate people. Sunday, they worked despite Ruth's usual insistence on observing the Sabbath. The community needed lumber, and every hour of delay meant children sitting in cold houses instead of warm classrooms when winter arrived. Members of the school board arrived Monday morning to inspect their progress. Men in clean clothes walked through the mill, examining stacks of cut lumber with critical eyes that missed nothing. "Fine workmanship," the chairman observed, running his hand along a pine plank's surface like caressing something precious. "Straight cuts, no tear out, quality that'll last generations." "We take pride in honest work," Ruth replied, though she looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. "How much more do you need to cut?" Ruth consulted her notebook with hands that shook like autumn leaves. 2,000 board feet. Should be finished by Wednesday. God willing." "Excellent." The chairman counted out money from a leather pouch, silver coins ringing against each other like church bells. "Here's partial payment, $500, balance when the order's complete." After the school board left, Ruth counted the money twice with trembling fingers, then locked it in their cash box like storing treasures in a vault. $500, she said quietly, voice thick with wonder. "More money than this mill's seen in 5 years combined. And if the belt fails before we finish the order, then we give back every penny and lose everything we've worked for." Ruth's hands shook as she closed the cash box. "But if it holds just a few more days, we're saved." Monday brought disaster and salvation wrapped in the same moment, like God's own sense of humor. The belt finally snapped completely at 10 in the morning, just as Jonah was feeding their largest pine log through the saw. But instead of tearing into useless pieces like they'd feared, the leather separated along a wire-wrapped section, creating two pieces that could potentially be spliced back together if they had enough skill and more luck than any two people deserved. Ruth stared at the broken belt with the expression of someone watching their own execution being prepared. "That's it," she whispered, voice hollow as an empty grave. "We're finished. Done. Those children won't have their school because I pushed machinery past any reasonable limit." But Jonah was already pulling leather strips from their emergency supply, driven by desperation that made heroes of ordinary people. "No, we splice it back together. With what we've used, every piece of spare leather we could find." Jonah began, unlacing his boots with hands that moved faster than thought. "Then we use what we have." He pulled the leather laces free and handed them to Ruth like offering communion wine. "Will these work for splicing?" Ruth examined the bootlaces, testing their strength against her calloused palms. "Maybe, if we braid them together, add wire reinforcement, and pray harder than we've ever prayed." They worked for 6 hours straight, creating a splice joint that looked more like folk art than mechanical repair. Bootlaces braided with copper wire, reinforced with metal brackets salvaged from broken machinery, bound together with desperation and whatever grace God reserves for people too stubborn to quit. When they finally re-engaged the belt, it turned with wobble that made the entire mill shake like an earthquake. But it turned. Tuesday and Wednesday blurred together in a haze of sawdust and determination that bordered on madness. The belt held together through sheer willpower, carrying them past every moment when logic said it should fail completely. On Wednesday evening, they cut the last board for the school order, 5,000 board feet of lumber, stacked and ready for pickup, representing more work than the mill had produced in years. Ruth shut down the engine and leaned against the workbench, her clothes soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air that carried promise of winter. "We did it," she said quietly, voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." The school board arrived Thursday morning with wagons and the balance of payment. $500 more, bringing their total to exactly what they needed to pay Thornley and still have money left for improvements. As the last wagon rolled away, loaded with lumber that would become classrooms and hope, Ruth pulled out her notebook and began calculating their final financial position. $900 gross revenue, she said, pencil moving across figures that told the story of their impossible success. Minus operating costs and materials, we net $763. Enough to pay the note and then some. Enough to pay that note with money left over for new equipment and winter supplies. Ruth closed the notebook with a snap that sounded like victory. "We're saved." Jonah, "Actually saved." But as she walked to the mill doors, preparing to lock up after their marathon production run, Ruth stopped so suddenly that Jonah nearly collided with her. "Sweet, merciful heaven," she breathed. "Look at this." She pointed to the belt, now motionless after 3 weeks of impossible strain and jury-rigged repairs. The leather had developed dozens of new cracks like spider webs. The wire wrapping had begun to unravel in places. The splice joint looked ready to separate completely at the slightest provocation. One more day of production would have killed it for certain. Ruth observed, voice filled with wonder. But we finished just in time. Ruth shook her head slowly, studying the belt with the attention of someone reading omens. No. Jonah, look closer at the timing. Jonah examined the belt more carefully and saw what had caught Ruth's attention like revelation. Fresh cracks were forming even as they watched. The leather stressed beyond all reasonable limits, continuing to deteriorate even at rest. It's still failing, Ruth said quietly, voice filled with something approaching awe. Even with the machinery shut down, that belt's coming apart like a prayer answered. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read, somewhere between gratitude and fear. If we'd started this order one day later, or if the school board had asked for just one more day of delivery time, we would have failed completely. Or, Ruth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, someone was watching over us. But as they walked back to the cabin in gathering dusk that painted the sky purple as church vestments, Jonah noticed Ruth's hands were shaking again. And this time, it wasn't from exhaustion or relief. What had really saved them? Luck, determination, or divine intervention? And why did Ruth look more frightened now than she had when their entire future hung by threads of patched leather and desperate hope? The morning after their triumph came quiet as Sunday service. No mill whistle, no grinding saws, no belt-driven machinery demanding attention every waking moment. Just coffee steaming in tin cups and the soft scratch of Ruth's pencil across paper that had become as familiar as prayer. She'd been calculating since before dawn, filling her notebook with figures that told the story of their impossible success. $763 net profit. More money than Jonah had seen in his entire adult life. More than his daddy had ever dreamed of earning from timber. Thornley's expecting us this afternoon, Ruth said, not looking up from her neat columns of numbers. You nervous about facing him? About paying off a debt that nearly killed us? Ruth's pencil paused mid-calculation. No. About what happens after we're free and clear. Jonah poured himself more coffee from the pot that had stayed warm on the back of the stove, studying Ruth's profile in the morning light that streamed through windows she'd scrubbed clean during their brief partnership. 3 months ago, she'd been a stranger stepping down from a wagon with a tool roll and sharp questions. Now her presence in his kitchen felt as natural as sunrise, as necessary as breathing. What do you mean, after? Ruth closed the notebook and met his eyes directly, no evasion or pretty words. Our partnership was about saving this mill from foreclosure. Once that debt's paid, what's left between us? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Jonah found himself studying Ruth's hands wrapped around her coffee cup, the calluses earned from saw work and machinery repair, the thin white scar from her leather knife. The practical strength that had rebuilt his failing operation through skill and determination he'd never possessed. I've been thinking, he said carefully, choosing words like stepping across thin ice, about expansion, hiring workers to help with production, maybe adding a planer to increase our finished lumber capacity. Sound business sense. Ruth's voice stayed neutral as creek water. You'll need capital for new equipment, wages for workers when you find them. We have capital now, more than enough for improvements. You have capital. Ruth stood and walked to the window, her back straight as fence posts. I was hired help, contract fulfilled, debt cleared. That's not how I see our arrangement. Ruth's shoulders tensed beneath her cotton blouse, like bowstrings drawn tight. How do you see it? Jonah joined her at the window, close enough to catch the scent of pine pitch that clung to her hair like memories of honest work. I see a partner who saved my mill, my daddy's land, my entire future. Someone who turned failure into success through skill I didn't even know I needed. And I'd like that partnership to continue. If you're willing, Ruth turned from the window, studying his face with the same careful attention she'd once given damaged machinery. On what terms exactly? The question demanded honesty. Jonah wasn't sure he could provide without stumbling over words like a schoolboy. Ruth deserved a business answer: profit shares, operational authority, clear expectations written down proper. But what he felt had moved beyond business into territory that scared him more than facing Thornley with empty pockets. Equal partnership, he said finally. In everything this mill produces. Everything meaning the lumber business. Everything meaning... Jonah stopped, realizing he was about to cross a line that would change their relationship forever. For better or worse. Meaning I'd like you to stay, not as hired help or temporary assistance, as my partner in building something that lasts longer than debt payments. Ruth studied his face like reading fine print on legal documents. What kind of partnership are you proposing? The kind that doesn't end when the bills are paid? Business partnership only. If that's what you want from me. Ruth's fingers worried the edge of her notebook, and Jonah noticed her hands were steadier now than they'd been during their desperate belt repairs. What if I want something different? What do you want, Ruth? Ruth was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mill that represented their shared triumph over circumstances that should have defeated them both. I want to wake up tomorrow knowing I have work that matters, knowing someone depends on my skills, values my judgment, trusts my decisions enough to make them partnership instead of charity. You have that already. Do I? Ruth faced him directly, eyes sharp as fresh ground axe blade. Or do I have temporary employment that ends when you find a proper wife to bear your children? The accusation stung because it held truth he couldn't deny. His original advertisement had sought a wife, not a business partner with calloused hands and sharp arithmetic. I never found a proper wife, Jonah said quietly. I found something considerably better, which is someone who makes me better at work I thought I understood. Someone who turns problems into opportunities through pure, stubborn determination. Someone whose coffee I look forward to every blessed morning. Ruth's expression softened slightly, like ice beginning to thaw. Those are practical reasons for partnership. There are other reasons beyond practical, such as... Jonah reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth that had belonged to his mother, the wedding ring he'd saved from the sale of her other jewelry during his daddy's worst drinking years, kept safe for a future that had seemed impossible until now, such as the fact that I'd rather face whatever comes next with you than face it alone. Ruth unwrapped the ring with careful fingers, examining the simple gold band worn smooth by years of honest work and faithful marriage. No fancy engravings or precious stones, just solid gold that had witnessed love lasting through good times and bad. This belonged to your mother. Wedding gift from my daddy, back when he still believed in things lasting longer than the next drink. Ruth turned the ring in her palm, testing its weight like evaluating lumber quality. What makes you think we'd last any better than they did? Nothing makes me think it. Everything makes me hope it. Ruth slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been sized for her hand by divine providence. She held it up to catch morning sunlight that made the gold gleam like promise. I should tell you something, she said. voice carrying weight of confession. About why I really came to answer your advertisement. What do you mean? Ruth walked to her tool chest and pulled out a folded letter, yellowed with age and handling. This came with your advertisement. Letter from Samuel Gentry, recommending your mill operation to women seeking honest work. Jonah read the letter quickly, recognizing Gentry's careful script. The storekeeper had written about the mill's potential, the quality timber stands, the honest character of the owner who deserved a chance at success. Gentry recommended me to you specifically, Jonah said, and to half a dozen other women looking for work in lumber operations. Ruth took back the letter, folding it with precise creases. I chose your mill not because of your advertisement, but because of his personal recommendation. You chose this place on purpose. I chose you specifically. Ruth's voice dropped to barely above whisper. Because Gentry wrote that you were decent, hard-working, and too proud to ask for help you desperately needed. And you wanted to help someone too proud to ask. I wanted to help someone who reminded me of Thomas. Ruth's fingers traced the letter's worn edges like reading scripture. Thomas was proud, decent, hard-working, and he died because he wouldn't ask for help when circumstances turned dangerous. So you came here to save me from Thomas's fate. I came here to save myself from wondering what would have happened if I'd been there to offer help. Thomas was too proud to request. Her voice carried years of regret and self-recrimination. Thought maybe I could heal old wounds by preventing new ones. The admission changed everything between them, rewriting the story of their partnership from desperate convenience to deliberate choice. Ruth hadn't simply responded to his advertisement, she'd chosen him as a way of healing grief that had followed her from Michigan lumber camps. And now, Jonah asked, now I've learned that saving someone else doesn't heal your own wounds, like you hope it will. Ruth looked at the ring on her finger, gold catching sunlight. But building something together with someone who values what you bring, that might actually work. A knock at the door interrupted them, sharp and authoritative. Through the window, Jonah saw Thornley's familiar black buggy parked outside, the banker having arrived early for their appointment. He's early, Ruth observed, closing her notebook with finality. They met Thornley on the porch, the banker carrying his leather portfolio and wearing the expression of someone expecting to deliver foreclosure papers. His pale eyes took in their appearance, clothes clean but showing honest wear, faces bearing the satisfaction of people who'd completed difficult work successfully. McKenna, Miss Kellerman. Thornley's voice carried formal courtesy, tinged with surprise. I trust you have the payment ready. Ruth pulled out their cash box and counted out $647 in silver coins and bills, each piece representing hours of desperate work and machinery held together by prayer. Payment in full, Mr. Thornley, every dollar accounted for. Thornley counted the money twice, his expression shifting from expectation through surprise to grudging respect that he couldn't quite hide. This payment is correct and complete. He pulled foreclosure papers from his portfolio and tore them in half with ceremony, the legal documents that had threatened their future becoming worthless scraps. Your debt is fully satisfied. McKenna, the mill and land remain yours, free and clear. Much obliged, Jonah said. Feeling weight lift from his shoulders that he'd carried so long, he'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Thornley pocketed the money and prepared to leave, then paused with something approaching curiosity. Might I ask how you managed such a remarkable turnaround? This mill was failing badly just months ago. Ruth and Jonah exchanged glances that spoke of shared trials and hard-won success. Good lumber, fair prices, honest work, Ruth replied simply. And competent management, Thornley added, looking directly at Ruth with respect he hadn't shown during his previous visit. I underestimated your capabilities. Miss Kellerman, my sincere apologies for that oversight. After Thornley's buggy disappeared down the valley road, Ruth and Jonah stood on the porch watching dust settle like benediction on ground that was finally, truly theirs. Free and clear, Ruth said, testing the words. Free and clear. Ruth turned the ring on her finger, catching afternoon sunlight in gold that promised years ahead. So what happens now, partner? Now we build something that lasts. Jonah offered his arm with formality that felt right for the moment. Starting with supper that doesn't taste like sawdust and worry. Ruth took his arm, smiling for the first time since he'd known her, a real smile that transformed her face from merely competent to genuinely beautiful. I make decent coffee. I know. That's one reason I'm marrying you. One reason. The others will take considerable time to properly explain. They walked back into the cabin together, leaving the mill silent behind them, but not for long. By evening, they'd planned expansion projects and equipment purchases that would keep them busy for years to come. The mill whistle would blow again come Monday, calling them to work that mattered, partnership that endured, and a future built on lumber, love, and the sound of machinery running smooth as clockwork. But first, supper, and the quiet satisfaction of debts paid, promises kept, and second chances that had grown into lifetime commitments through honest work and mutual respect. The ring caught lamplight as Ruth prepared their meal, and Jonah realized he'd finally found what his daddy's generation had lost through drink and disappointment work worth doing. With someone worth doing it alongside. Outside, evening wind stirred through pine branches that would provide lumber for years to come, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of children's laughter drifted from the valley where their new school was already taking shape. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand adventures or dramatic rescues. They're about ordinary folks discovering that partnership built on mutual respect creates something stronger than either person could achieve alone. Jonah and Ruth's story reminds us that true connection happens not through romantic fantasy, but through shared work toward common goals. Their mill became more than a business. It became the foundation for a community that valued skill over sentiment, character over convenience. In our modern world of instant connections and disposable relationships, there's something deeply satisfying about watching two people earn each other's trust through honest labor. Ruth didn't save Jonah's mill through feminine wiles or gentle persuasion. She saved it through professional competence and sheer determination. Jonah didn't win Ruth's heart through grand gestures. He won it by recognizing her value and offering genuine partnership. Their lumber fed the rebuilding of that schoolhouse, connecting their personal success to community welfare. The children who would learn in those classrooms represented the future their partnership had helped secure through mills that ran on respect rather than rescue. This story celebrates the quiet heroism of people who choose cooperation over competition, who build rather than tear down, who find love through respect rather than desperation. Disclaimer: this is a work of fiction inspired by Western frontier themes, created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.